The music swelled around her like a cruel joke. Alara stood at the edge of the Thornwood ballroom, her back pressed against the cold silk wall covering, watching her husband's hand rest gently on Lady Verity's waist. He spun her with an elegance that stole the breath from every guest in the room. His dark head bent low, murmuring something that made the lady laugh, a soft, intimate sound that cut through the strings of the quartet. Alara's gloved fingers tightened around her champagne flute until the crystal threatened to crack. She had been standing there for nearly an hour. Not once had he looked her way. Whispers started behind her, quiet but sharp, meant to be heard. The Duchess of Thornwood, so plain beside him. I heard he only married her for the northern lands. Old blood, empty coffers. He still mourns his first wife. Everyone knows. This one is just a replacement he never wanted. Alara's throat tightened, but she lifted her chin a fraction. She would not let them see the tremor in her hand. She set the champagne down, turned, and walked through the crowd like a ghost drifting through walls. No one stopped her. No one called her name. Her husband, the Duke of Thornwood, Cassian Ashford, did not even notice she had left. She climbed the grand staircase alone, the music fading into a muted hum below. The portrait gallery stretched before her, dimly lit, filled with centuries of Ashford faces. At the end hung the painting of the first Duchess, Helena. Golden hair, laughing blue eyes, a smile that promised sunshine. Alara paused before it as she did every night. She had learned long ago not to compete with a memory. She placed a hand flat against her own chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of a heart that had tried for a year to love a man made of stone and shadow. Tonight, something inside her finally broke. She did not weep. Weeping required hope, and hope had become a distant, foreign shore. Instead, she walked to her chambers, dismissed her maid with a quiet word, and sat before the small writing desk. The candle flickered. She pulled a ledger from the drawer, the one she used to manage the household accounts. She would not be a duchess who languished. She would be a duchess who served. Tomorrow, she would begin visiting the tenant farms herself, learning their names, their struggles. She would pour her longing into something that could grow. Her husband wanted a marriage of paper and duty. Very well. She would give him exactly that and nothing more. The next morning arrived crisp and pale. Alara dressed in a simple wool gown of dove gray, no jewels, no elaborate coiffure. She instructed the housekeeper that she would be out until evening and took only a footman with her. The estate was vast, green hills rolling under a silver sky. The first cottage she entered belonged to a widow with 3 small children. The roof leaked. The youngest had a cough that rattled like pebbles in a tin. Alara knelt on the packed dirt floor, held the little girl's hand, and listened to the widow's story. She promised a new roof before the next rain and sent for her own physician. When she left, the widow wept with gratitude, clutching Alara's hands as if she were something holy. That simple touch warmed Alara far more than any ballroom dance ever had. She returned to Thornwood Hall at dusk, mud on her hem and a strange lightness in her chest. The entrance hall echoed with her solitary footsteps. As she removed her gloves, the library door opened and Cassian stepped out. He was tall, impossibly still, his dark blue eyes sweeping over her stained gown with a flicker of surprise that vanished instantly. "You missed tea," he said. Not a question. Merely an observation. Alara met his gaze, and for the first time she did not search it for hidden warmth. "I was with the tenants," she replied, her voice steady. "Mrs. Dallow's roof has collapsed. I authorized the repairs." He studied her for a heartbeat longer. "That is the steward's duty." "I am the Duchess," she said simply. "Their welfare is mine." Something crossed his face, too swift to name, and then the mask returned. He nodded once and retreated into the library, closing the door with a soft click. That click became the sound of a door inside her heart, shutting forever. Alara did not stand in the hallway hoping he would open it again. She walked upstairs, washed her hands, and wrote a list of every tenant family on Thornwood land. The weeks that followed transformed her. She rose early and returned late, her hands rough from carrying baskets of bread, her mind filled with crop rotations and drainage ditches. She learned that the blacksmith's son had a gift for numbers, so she arranged a scholarship at the village school. She sat with the elderly baker as he recovered from a fever, reading aloud from his favorite books. The staff at Thornwood Hall began to look at her differently. So did the villagers. They no longer saw the Duke's silent, invisible wife. They saw Lady Alara, who remembered their names, who listened, who stayed. And slowly, her absence from the great house became a presence felt in every corner of the estate but one. Cashin began to notice, not because he was watching her, but because the silence in the hall had changed. Before, her silence had been heavy with waiting, a hope that strained toward him. Now it was simply empty, a clean, tranquil emptiness. At dinner, she spoke politely of estate matters, weather, village health. She did not linger over her wine, waiting for a conversation that would never blossom. She excused herself early, leaving him alone at the long table with a single candle burning. The loneliness that had always been his chosen armor began to feel, for the first time, like a cold he could not shake. One evening, a carriage arrived bearing an unexpected guest. Sir Aldrich Branning, a young baronet from a neighboring county, brought a letter of introduction from a mutual acquaintance. He was handsome in an open, sunlit way, with warm brown eyes and an easy laugh that filled the foyer. He had come to discuss sheep breeding of all things, but his gaze kept drifting toward Alara. At dinner, he asked her about the tenant projects. She answered with animation, her cheeks flushing slightly as she described the new well being dug near the eastern fields. Cashin, seated at the head of the table, watched this exchange with a growing tightness in his chest that he refused to name. After the meal, Sir Aldrich lingered in the drawing room. "Your Grace," he said to Alara, his voice lowered with genuine admiration, "I've rarely met a woman of such practical kindness. The people here are fortunate." Alara smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes, and Cashin saw it from the doorway. That smile had once been offered to him, timid and tremulous, across the breakfast table in their first month of marriage. He had looked away then, buried behind his newspaper, his heart still encased in grief. Now, watching another man receive it so easily, something hot and possessive coiled in his stomach. He turned and walked away before he could do something foolish, but the image of that smile burned behind his eyelids all night. The following afternoon, Cashin found himself riding toward the eastern fields, a direction he had not taken in years. The sound of hammering led him to the site of the new well, where a small crowd had gathered. Alara stood among the workers, her hair slipping free of its pins, her hands dusty. She was laughing at something Sir Aldrich had just said, the baronet holding a bucket as if it were the most important task in the kingdom. Cashin dismounted, and the group fell silent, bowing their heads. Alara's laughter faded gently, and she turned to him with a composed, polite expression. "Your Grace, is something wrong?" He hated the formal address on her lips. He hated that he had no right to demand the warmth she gave so freely to a stranger. "I came to observe the progress," he said, his tone cooler than he intended. Sir Aldrich stepped forward with easy confidence. "The Duchess has overseen every detail. The stone layer should be finished by tomorrow." Cashin's gaze flickered to the younger man. "Then I thank you for your assistance, Sir Aldrich. I will take over from here." The dismissal was unmistakable. Sir Aldrich blinked, then bowed to Alara with a gentle smile. "Your Grace, it has been an honor." He left, and the workers suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Alone with her husband in the dusty field, Alara brushed her hands against her skirt. "You were unkind just now. Sir Aldrich only meant to help." "You do not need his help," Cashin replied, the words sharp and swift as a blade. "You are the Duchess of Thornwood." She tilted her head, studying him as if seeing a stranger. "I have been the Duchess of Thornwood for a year. You have never once objected to anyone helping me before, because you never once noticed whether I was helped or not." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. Alara turned and walked back toward the hall, leaving him standing in the half-finished well, surrounded by the evidence of a life she had built entirely without him. That night he found himself in the portrait gallery, staring at Helena's painting. Her blue eyes seemed to mock him. He had held on to grief like a sacred flame, believing his coldness to be a tribute to lost love. But standing there, he felt only a hollow, gnawing emptiness. The flame had gone out long ago, and he had never let himself notice. He wandered the dark corridors until his feet carried him, unbidden, to Alara's chambers. The door was slightly ajar. A candle burned low on the writing desk. She was asleep in her chair, a letter half-written beneath her folded arms. He stepped inside soundlessly, his shadow stretching across the floor. He did not mean to read the words, but the slant of her handwriting caught the light. "Dearest mother, I no longer wait for love. I have found purpose instead, and perhaps that is its own kind of salvation. The people here have given me a reason to breathe. I shall not ask for more." Cashin read the lines 3 times, each word a splinter burying itself deeper. She no longer waited. She had stopped hopping. He had done this. Quietly he withdrew, but the knowledge settled into his bones and kept him awake until dawn. Days later, a rainstorm lashed the countryside. The river swelled and flooded the lower village. Alara was gone before the household even stirred, organizing sandbags and evacuating families. Cashin followed in a cold panic he could not explain, riding through the downpour until he found her in a cottage half-submerged, carrying a child through waist-high water. Her face was pale, her lips tinged blue, but she would not stop. He waded in after her, shouting her name over the roar of the storm. She looked up, startled, and for one fleeting moment something raw and unguarded flickered in her eyes. Then exhaustion claimed her, and she crumpled. He caught her before she could vanish beneath the water, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her to higher ground, to a dry stable where a fire had been hastily lit. The villagers gathered blankets and hot tea. Cashin held her against his chest, his greatcoat wrapped around them both, and for the first time in their marriage he allowed himself to feel the terror of losing her. Her eyelids fluttered. She whispered something faint. "The child, is she safe?" He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yes, rest now." She obeyed, her head falling against his shoulder, with a trust that shattered him completely. They returned to Thornwood Hall in the gray, sodden dawn. The physician declared her suffering from exhaustion and a weakness of the heart that had likely troubled her since childhood, worsened by months of overwork and inadequate rest. Cashin stood in the corner of her bedchamber, watching the shallow rise and fall of her breathing, and remembered every meal she had skipped to visit a tenant, every cold morning she had risen before the sun. He had let her pour herself out like water from a cracked cup, and he had not once tried to catch her. While she slept, he unlocked a trunk that had remained sealed since Helena's death. Inside lay her letters, her jewelry, her diaries. He had not touched them in years, preserving them like relics. But now, driven by a desperate need to understand his own frozen heart, he began to read. The diaries were not filled with love poems to her husband. They were filled with restless complaints, with frustration at his solemnity, with confessions of flirtations at court, and finally, with a cold, calculated admission that she had married him only for his title and had never intended to be faithful. The riding accident that took her life had occurred while she was fleeing to meet a lover in the next county. Cashin's hands shook as he read the final entry. The perfect love he had mourned, the shrine he had built in his mind, had been nothing but a lie he told himself to avoid facing the emptiness of his own existence. He burned the diaries in the library fireplace, page by page, watching the flames consume the false idol that had kept him from the woman lying frail upstairs. The smoke stung his eyes, but he did not weep. He did not deserve the relief of tears. When Alara woke 3 days later, she found him sitting beside her bed, unshaven, dark circles bruising the skin beneath his eyes. He held a cup of broth, his hands far from steady. She blinked at him, still weak, confusion clouding her gaze. You've been here. "Every hour," he said, his voice hoarse. "The physician said your heart. Alara, why did you never tell me?" She turned her face toward the window. "You never asked." The simple answer landed like a lash. He set the cup down and took her hand, the one that lay limp on the coverlet. She flinched slightly, and he nearly let go, but he forced himself to hold on. "I have been a blind fool," he said. "I buried myself in a grief that was not even true, and I let you fade in front of me. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I am begging you to stay. Not for duty, not for the estate, for me." His voice cracked on the final word. Alara turned her head slowly back, searching his face as if for a trap. "What has changed?" she whispered. "What truth have you discovered that suddenly makes me worth your notice?" He could not lie to her. He told her everything about the diaries, about the lie he had cherished, about the cold, hollow man he had become. "I am not offering you a ghost shadow. I am offering you a man who has finally woken up, terrified that he has lost you before he ever truly had you." Silence stretched between them, fragile as a spider's thread. Then Alara's fingers, weak but deliberate, curled around his. "I stopped hopping for this," she said, her voice trembling. "I taught myself not to need you. If you pull away again, Cassian, I will not survive it a second time." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence he had never shown any living soul. "Then I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to fear that again." She did not answer with words. She simply closed her eyes, and a single tear slid down her temple into the pillow. But she did not pull her hand away. She held on, and that small, stubborn grip was the most precious gift he had ever received. Recovery came slowly. The physician insisted on weeks of rest, and Alara chafed against the forced stillness, but Cassian remained by her side with a patience that astonished the entire household. He read to her from novels he would once have dismissed as frivolous. He brought her tea himself, learning exactly how much honey she preferred. He wheeled her in a chair to the garden when the weather warmed, tucking blankets around her knees with a gentleness that made the older servants exchange startled glances. The cold Duke had melted, and they did not quite know what to make of it. The villagers, too, noticed the change. When Alara was strong enough to accept visitors, a steady stream of tenants came to the hall, bearing wildflowers and small gifts. Cassian welcomed them himself, standing at the door of her sitting room, listening to them praise his wife's kindness. Pride swelled in his chest, a fierce, protective pride that had nothing to do with title or land. She had won them entirely on her own. He was merely the man lucky enough to stand beside her. Sir Aldrich Branning called once more, with a bouquet of hothouse roses and a hopeful expression. Cassian intercepted him in the entrance hall. "The Duchess is recovering and cannot receive gentlemen visitors alone," he said, his tone impeccably polite but his stance immovable. "I shall accompany you." Sir Aldrich's smile flickered, then faded completely when he saw Alara's hand resting in Cassian as they entered the room. The baronet made brief, stilted conversation and departed soon after. Alara looked up at her husband with a knowing, weary amusement. That was unnecessary. Cassian knelt beside her chair, something he had never done in front of anyone before. "On the contrary," he murmured, "it was absolutely essential." She laughed softly, a sound he had not heard in months, and the last icy splinter around his heart melted away. Yet healing was not a straight path. One evening, as summer deepened and fireflies dotted the lawns, Alara found him in the portrait gallery. He stood before the empty space where Helena's painting had hung. He had removed it himself, unwilling to let a false memory poison the air any longer. She came to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "You do not have to erase her," she said quietly. "She was part of your story, but you cannot let the past steal your future." He turned to look at her, the woman who had nearly slipped through his fingers. "She was a lesson I had to learn," he said. "You are the story I want to live." He pulled her gently into his arms, careful of her still fragile strength, and rested his chin atop her head. They stood there, two people woven together by duty, fractured by distance, and slowly, painstakingly, mended by truth. The confession came not as a single grand moment, but as 1,000 small ones stitched together. In the way he learned her preferred walking paths and joined her without being asked. In the way she began to leave her study door open, inviting him into her world of ledgers and tenant letters. In the way he defended her quiet opinions at county assemblies, his voice cold steel against anyone who dared dismiss her. In the way she caught him watching her across the breakfast table with an expression of naked, wondering gratitude that made her cheeks warm. And one moonlit night, on the stone bench overlooking the rose garden she had revived from neglect, He spoke the words that had been building in him like a tide. "I loved you too late," he said, his voice raw and unpolished. "But I love you now with everything I am, everything I should have been from the start. If you can forgive me, I will spend the rest of our days proving it." She looked at him, her eyes clear and luminous, no longer guarded. "I forgave you the moment I realized you were hurting too," she said. "We were both so lost, but I think we've found our way home." He kissed her then, gently, a promise rather than a demand. And when they parted, the air between them felt new and golden, like sunrise after endless rain. The months that followed were not without challenges. She still struggled with occasional fatigue. He still carried shadows of guilt. But together they rebuilt Thornwood Hall into a place of laughter. They opened a school in the village, funded by her careful management. They hosted gatherings that were not stiff, cold affairs, but evenings filled with music and honest conversation. She taught him to listen, truly listen, to the people who depended on them. He taught her that it was safe to lean on someone, that strength did not mean standing alone. One afternoon in late autumn, they stood on a hill overlooking the estate, the fields golden with harvested wheat. She leaned against him, his arm around her, her head finding its perfect place in the curve of his shoulder. "I used to think love was something that had to be earned," she murmured. "But it's not. It's something you build day by day with someone who stays." He pressed a kiss to her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and wood smoke. "Then let us build, my darling. For as long as we both shall live." Below them, the well she had overseen sparkled in the distance, a simple circle of stone that had become, for both of them, a monument to hope. And so the Duchess who had once been invisible became the very heart of Thornwood, beloved not because she demanded it, but because she gave herself away and found herself returned tenfold. The Duke, who had been a cold, distant figure, learned that true strength was not armor, but the courage to feel, to fail, and to begin again. Their love was not a sudden fire, but a slow, steady hearth, built on the ashes of old sorrow and lit by the quiet grace of second chances. They walked back toward the hall hand in hand, and behind them, the sun set in ribbons of rose and amber, painting the sky with the colors of a promise finally kept.